Good morning, everyone. My name is Vicky McDonald, and it's my great privilege to be the State Librarian and CEO of this fantastic library. And on behalf of my colleagues who are here today, I welcome you to our Community Day, 50 years and counting, on the anniversary of the 1967 referendum. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay respects to the ancestors who came before them. The location of State Library is on Kirilpa Point, which is a traditional meeting, gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal peoples, and we proudly continue that tradition today. I also acknowledge and welcome the Honourable Leanne Enoch, Minister for Innovation, Science and the Digital Economy and Minister for Small Business, Songwoman Marichi Baramba for her moving welcome this morning, but also for sharing your reflections with us today. It's very much appreciated. Also, Dr. Chelsea Bond, our keynote speaker for today, and Chelsea's a senior lecturer at the University of Queensland's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Unit, and Chelsea's also a former board member, so it's terrific to welcome you back to State Library, Chelsea. And of course, a warm welcome to everyone. It's fantastic to have you here with us today. We would like to welcome you to State Library for this special Community Day as we acknowledge and reflect upon the 50th anniversary of the 1967 referendum that saw constitutional change and counting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Australian census for the first time. Welcomed also to everyone who's joining us via live stream across Queensland and beyond. Whether you are from a local public library, an Indigenous Knowledge Centre, or viewing us in your home or on your portable device, wherever you are on this Saturday morning, we welcome you as well. State Library has a long and proud history of working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. As a respected cultural institution, we value and celebrate Indigenous peoples and cultures and acknowledge that their stories are integral to the history of our state. Our heritage is a critical contributor to our identity, linking the memories of our state's past to our present lives and future development. State Library's collections create opportunities for all Queenslanders to understand and celebrate their unique identity and heritage. So I'm a Queenslander, so that's a red port that you see on the screen there today, and it's one of our most historical artefacts from our collection, the Lambert McBride collection. Lambert was an active campaigner for Indigenous rights in the 60s, and in the lead up to the 1967 referendum, he drove around Australia with his wife to encourage Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians to register and exercise their right to vote. Lambert carried his campaigning materials in his red port, and after his death, Lambert's daughter Linda gathered her parents' what we call ephemera into the suitcase and donated it to the State Library. It's currently on exhibition in our Freedom Then, Freedom Now exhibition, which is in the Philip Bacon Heritage Gallery on level 4. So if you'd like to have a look at the exhibition today, we do encourage you to do that. At State Library, we are committed to reconciliation and acknowledge the vital role that it can play in building an understanding and acceptance of our shared history and respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. In 2002, we established the first Indigenous Knowledge Centre as an information hub and cultural preservation centre and a community gathering and sharing place. Today, the State Library now supports 23 Indigenous knowledge centres throughout the state, and which are transformative places of education, literacy and sharing, and combine traditional library services with a community space for learning, capacity building and strengthening cultural identity. We are also very proud that we have Kyril Dargan here in our South Bank building. And Kyril Dargan facilitates community connection, advocacy, and the creating, sharing and preserving of Indigenous knowledge, ideas and experiences. The Kyril Dargan team have organised today's event, and thank you very much for the work that's gone into organising that, but also our latest exhibition in Kyril Dargan, Don't Just Count Us, Let Us Count. And they've done a truly marvellous job in the lead up to National Reconciliation Week as well. So before you leave today, I do encourage you to have a look in Kyril Dargan, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what's happening down there towards the end of this morning's event. On level 4 of the building stands Fiona Foley's artwork, Black Opium, which serves as a powerful reminder of a dark period in our state's history, the devastating effect of the Aboriginal protection and restriction of the Sale of Opium Act 1967 on the independence and spirit of successive generations of Indigenous peoples. And if you stand on level 4, you can look up and see that quite amazing artwork. Today, we continue the commitment of working with Indigenous communities and preserving their history and stories by commemorating the 50th anniversary of the 1967 referendum, a landmark milestone for Indigenous rights in Australia. Today's speaker will delve into the significance of the referendum as they share their personal stories of how the constitutional change impacted their families' lives and their individual lives as well. I would now like to invite the Honourable Leanne Enoch, Minister for Innovation, Science and the Digital Economy and Minister for Small Business, to the stage to share her reflections on the 1967 referendum and to officially launch the event. Thank you, Minister.
Thanks, Vicky. Thank you so much. Let me also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, and in doing so may I acknowledge the more than 3,000 generations of Turrbal people who have maintained cultural practices on this country. And can I also acknowledge all of our elders from wherever you come from, whatever your culture, wherever your country, those that are past and those still with us, guiding us into the future. Can I, of course, acknowledge Vicky McDonald, our State Librarian and CEO, Dr. Chelsea Bond, who is our keynote speaker this morning. But can I also acknowledge all of you, aunties, uncles, brothers and sisters, who've not only taken a walk this morning, but are taking the time to be part of a very important conversation about what has happened in the last 50 years. When you have an anniversary like this, 50 years since a referendum, it is a moment where you can reflect on that time. It's a moment when you can recognise the work of so many during that last 50 years. And of course, it is also a time where we can acknowledge that there is still more to be done. But this morning, I was talking to Chelsea before official proceedings began. I was kind of feeling a bit excited because the Uluru Statement was made late last night or yesterday afternoon, and to see those words now being published this morning, there's something very interesting that is about to happen in this country. And it makes me think about 1967 and that feeling of something is about to happen that's going to change things forever. To introduce myself properly to all of you, I am a Ngugi woman of the Quandamooka Nation, which takes in the waters and islands of Moreton Bay. I'm originally from beautiful North Stradbroke Island. We call it Minjerribah. But I also acknowledge my grandmother's country. She was a Kanju woman from the far north of Queensland. So in doing that, I also acknowledge that I have family. I have many family sitting in these chairs here, and no doubt live streaming from all parts of the state and the country. So let me make a special acknowledgement to my family members. But if we reflect then at that time, 1967, when people were feeling the optimism and something exciting that I'm already feeling about the Uluru Statement, you can imagine the energy that people felt about pursuing what was going to be a big change for our country. This year I turned 49, so I was born in 1968, the year after the referendum. But I still felt the buzz of that as a young girl, felt the buzz of that excitement of something had happened, something very significant had happened in our country. I was very fortunate to have spent my younger years on North Stradbroke Island with people like Ani Cathwalk or Oodgeroo Noonuccal and others who had been very passionate about the 1967 referendum. They spent day and night, every hour they could, to push this agenda because they knew that this would make a massive difference to our people, not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Of course that would make a huge difference, but a big difference to the country. So as we now look onto the horizon, the next 50 years, what is going to be occurring during that time and what our role will be in all of that. As we digest the Uluru Statement and the potential referendum that we'll see that will come from that, there is a role for all of us, no matter where you come from, no matter where you live in this state or in this country, no matter what side of politics you might be on. There is a role for all of us to be passionate and energetic about what is going to happen next. And my great dream is that 50 years from now, when we're celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the 1967 referendum, that the generation after us, some of whom are here in this auditorium, that they are talking about the massive shift that happened in our lifetime, that we had something to do with, and that they will be collecting up red ports and other materials that we were part of, and they'll be sharing that to their children and looking for the next possible massive shift for our country. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation today. Thank you for your energy and your commitment and dedication to what is right and good in this country. And I know that after the Uluru Statement, there is something very interesting that's about to happen, and every single one of us can feel the energy around that. But ladies and gentlemen, I have an official role. I've just not used any of the speech that I had. I have an official role to do, and that is to officially launch today's Community Day. There is no better place to be celebrating the anniversary of the 1967 referendum than in our state library. This is a place where we respectfully collect and preserve the stories of our peoples from all walks of life, from every culture. And to be able to celebrate the story of the 1967 referendum here, I feel it's a very special place to be able to do that. So I congratulate everybody who's been involved in that. And it's my official duty to officially launch today, the Community Day. This event this morning, we have the absolute pleasure of having the amazing Dr. Chelsea Bond as our keynote speaker. She is going to discuss some of the important issues around the 1967 referendum and what has happened in the last 50 years. Chelsea is a good friend to many of us and an incredible advocate in our community. She is a Mununjali and South Sea Islander woman, a senior lecturer at the University of Queensland's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Unit and an affiliate member of UQ's Posh Centre for Indigenous Health. A well-respected academic and member of Brisbane's Indigenous community, Chelsea has spent almost 20 years working to improve Indigenous health in South East Queensland as a community health worker and health researcher. Chelsea also hosts the Let's Talk segment on Radio 98.9 FM, part of the National Indigenous Radio Service, and was a former member of the Library Board of Queensland. I'm truly honoured to be here today to commemorate such a significant moment in Australia's history and to welcome you all to 50 years and counting in recognition of the 50th anniversary of the 1967 referendum. I hope you enjoy the rest of today's events. But ladies and gentlemen, can you please join me in welcoming my friend and a true champion of our community, Dr. Chelsea Bond.
Thank you. Good morning. As a visitor to this place, I would like to acknowledge and thank Animaruchi Bramba for your welcome this morning. I'd like to acknowledge you for your ongoing custodianship of this place that many of us have come to call home. I'd like to acknowledge the Minister for Innovation and Science and the Digital Economy, the Honourable Leanne Enoch, not just for being here today, but for being there as an honourable ancestor. It does us very proud to see a proud, strong Noongar woman do what you do every day. I'd like to acknowledge the State Library of Queensland, Vicky McDonald, and especially the Kurraldargan team under the custodianship of Amanda Heyman for hosting what promises to be a really exciting conversation today. I'd also like to acknowledge you for coming out this Saturday morning, and I want to give a shout out to those who walked this morning from Spring Hill and walked to be here today. I'd also like to acknowledge our elders that are here, whose struggles, efforts and wisdom I have benefited from in my own life, and whose legacy I can only aspire to continue in the spirit of. I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to reflect today, some 50 years later, And in doing so, I must first locate myself in relationship to this place and to this story. I belong to the Malanjali people of the Yugambeh language group through the Williams family. Bond is my married name. I was born a Wadigo. Shout out to the Wadigos here. Which denotes my South Sea Islander heritage and stands as a living reminder of the history of slavery in this country. Between 1863 through to 1904, it is estimated that approximately 62,000 South Sea Islanders were brought to Queensland. Whether recruited, coerced, deceived or forced, it was off the backs of black labour that the Queensland sugar industry was built. I was born in Yuggera country and raised in the outer southern suburbs of Brisbane. I want to acknowledge that I was born over a decade after the 67 referendum. Sorry. So as such, I cannot really speak with any authority about the referendum in terms of regaling you with stories of 50 years ago and the intentions, motivations and efforts of those who have successfully campaigned for the yes vote and of which we are commemorating today. I cannot speak for those people and I cannot do justice to their experiences, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who fought so very hard to achieve the resounding yes vote. How I came to be here in a geographic sense starts with an honourable ancestor, Billen, and his wife Nellie. Billen had reached adulthood before he encountered Europeans. His daughter Emily married William Williams, a Malanjali man from Beaudesert. My great-grandmother, Clara Williams, was one of their 14 children. They lived under the 1897 restriction of the Sale of Opium and Protection Act, which was Queensland legislation that governed almost every aspect of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's lives up until the 1960s, and here in Queensland certainly beyond that period. There would be not one Indigenous person in the state of Queensland who could articulate their family tree without referencing their relationship to this piece of legislation. Commonly referred to as the Act, this legislation enabled the state of Queensland to remove Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples off our lands onto government or church-run institutions, making us wards of the state. Controlling who we could marry, where we could work, where we could travel, whether we could rear our own children and retain our own income, among other things. In commemorating this day, I want to acknowledge that despite the progress that we celebrate post-1967, we have yet to see all of the stolen wages, all of the stolen children, and all of the stolen lands returned to us. Growing up, my father told us stories of how his grandmother had to evade authorities as children to avoid being removed off their lands and away from their family. My grandmother, Clara Williams, gained an exemption from the Act as a young woman in 1913. She moved away from Beaudesert and relocated to Tweed Heads, where she married a South Sea Islander man, Tom Slockey. It was in her later years that she, along with some of her siblings, settled in the outer southern suburbs of Brisbane. The granddaughter of one of her siblings is Auntie Loris Williams, whose life and legacy as an advocate and archivist of Indigenous family history is honoured here in level 1 of this building. As a young man, my father, Vernon Wadigo, went to live with his grandmother, Clara Williams, and it was here that he met my mother, a white Australian woman of English and Irish heritage, my mother, Elaine Wadigo, who is here today. They married in 1968 and are pictured here with Dad's grandparents. They raised 4 children, of which I am the youngest. As a young woman, I met my husband, a Bidjara and Quandamooka man, and we too were married in the church that my parents were wed. We started a family in the neighbourhood in which he was born, just a few suburbs over, called Inala. Inala has become our home for us and our 5 children. I am a senior lecturer at the University of Queensland's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Unit, but I first trained as an Aboriginal health worker, working in a number of urban and rural communities in southeast Queensland. It wasn't too long after studying and working with Indigenous health that I undertook a research career. Now, my aspirations to be a researcher were not due to the appeal of an academic career. Instead, it was driven by my frustrations by the ways in which I was meant to know myself as an Aborigine. Much of my training and much of what I learnt about myself under the guise of health advancement appeared to emphasise the incapacities and ailments of the Aborigine. My disciplinary training taught me to think of myself as a risk factor, as a problem, which was in stark contrast to what I knew about myself and our experiences as Indigenous peoples. It was thus out of an act of resistance to the production of racialised knowledges within academic institutions that I find myself here. Now, in outing myself as a health researcher, I want to make clear that my disciplinary training did not make me the best placed person to be speaking about the intricacies and implications of the Constitution. In locating myself, I guess you're wondering what it is that I can talk about, from what place I can speak from, and why did the State Library of Queensland even ask me to speak? I don't know. While I may not be a constitutional lawyer, as an Aboriginal person, I have been unable to be oblivious to government legislation and controls inflicted upon Aboriginal people. It is enmeshed in my story and in my body. My life and my location here today has been shaped by government control and surveillance over the Aborigine, and today my being as an Aborigine continues to be crafted and curtailed at every turn. Typically, as Aboriginal people, we seek to resist our degradation and dehumanisation by insisting upon our rights, upon our humanness, upon our sameness. Often we articulate these claims through asserting an alternative truth to what it is to be an Aborigine. Certainly within my own discipline, I've spent a fair amount of my energy correcting the account, testifying to what it really means to be an Aborigine. But that work is tiring. And I now come to question whether such work is all that liberating. I've come to accept that the impossibility of the task of trying to prove my humanness via the social category of the Aborigine. Increasingly, I'm less certain as to whether I'm really an Aborigine after all, and I don't mean in the authentic traditional sense. You see, the first fleet, when it arrived in 1788 in Botany Bay, or rather the land of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, they did not just bring with it convicts, marines, seamen and civil officers. It brought with it the Aborigine. Until then, the Aborigine did not exist in this land. We were Mananjali, Yagara, Turrbal, Gubbi Gubbi, Bunjalung. We were many things, but Aborigines we were not. Our racialised construction as Aborigines came on a boat, sailing across the seas, and it has served the colonial project very well. Through being raced, we were not just named, it enabled us to be claimed. The need to organise human beings into racial classifications finds its origins in the Enlightenment, inspired by the impetus to make sense of the world, bringing order to chaos. Racial classificatory systems were more than just organising human beings into groups. It enabled a hierarchical ordering of superior and inferior human beings, which conveniently placed white Europeans at the very top. Critical race scholar David Goldberg asserts that European expansion across the globe was rationalised in racial terms. The ideas of race were not simply moral judgments, they were empirical descriptions. According to Goldberg, race was turned into a foundational code, cemented in place by scientists, philosophers, writers, artists, public intellectuals, journalists, clergy, politicians and bureaucrats, each of which became the day labourers or bricklayers of racial foundations. The Aborigine is not just a term or a title, it carries with it a particular social meaning that circumscribes our being, our relationship to this place and to the state. We have become known by them and through our relationship to them, one which has cemented a relationship of power over us, physically, morally, intellectually, politically, and legislatively. Now, at this point, you might be asking, what has race got to do with the referendum anniversary? It's central to what I wish to talk about today, and it's at the heart of the constitutional changes that the yes vote enabled. There are many myths that surround the 1967 referendum in terms of what it did for the Aborigines, and they are entangled in the myths surrounding race and the Aborigine, each of which I wish to attend to today. And somewhat provocatively, I want to interrogate whether our celebration of this particular moment in history is worthy of celebration. Now, I pose this question not to dismiss the efforts of those who work tirelessly to campaign for constitutional changes, or to be cheekily dismissive of the changes that have occurred since 1967, which I know I have been a beneficiary of. But on what appears to be the eve of another referendum on constitutional change via the recognised movement, I want to reflect upon the referendum and the 50 years that have transpired and consider what lessons could be learnt. What can our past tell us about our future? And what is being promised to us? I'm intrigued by what we could learn, not so much about constitutional changes and the so-called race's power, but what can we learn about the power of race? On this day, 50 years ago, 90% of Australians voted yes. But what did they vote yes for? If we look to some of the early campaign imagery, it appeared that the yes vote was a vote for Aborigines, a vote for Aboriginal rights, a vote for Aboriginal citizenship, a vote to end discrimination against Indigenous peoples, and indeed many people today still believe that the referendum achieved all of those things, but it did not. A vote in the referendum led to the alteration of two clauses in the Australian Constitution, which related to sections 51 and 127, which read as follows. The yes vote enabled these two clauses to be amended, which saw the removal of the words other than Aboriginal people in any state, removed from section 51, and the whole of section 127 removed. Now, the removal of section 127 simply enabled Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be counted in the census. Yet this has often been conflated with the granting of citizenship rights, and certainly the clause as it stood suggested that not counting us reflected a sentiment that we didn't count as citizens or as people. And this idea was put to work in the campaign to secure the yes vote. Atwood and Marcus have described how the success of the yes campaign, led by the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, was due to its appeal to a set of liberal principles of rights and equality. The Federal Council represented section 127 as racially discriminatory and offensive, given the national census enumerated the number of sheep and cattle, but not Aboriginal people. The publicity materials encouraged Australians to give Aborigines a fair go. One spokesperson claimed, "When you write yes, you are holding out the hand of friendship and wiping out nearly 200 years of injustice." These ideas were taken up and endorsed in media reporting, with The Age at the time stating that the yes vote in support of repealing section 127 would give Aborigines the right to be called Australian. The Sydney Morning Herald too stated that it was a referendum on the status of Aborigines. The Melbourne Herald argued that it was a referendum on whether discrimination should be ended. Many Aboriginal spokespeople at the time saw the referendum as a referendum on race relations. Whether we would be counted on the census was associated with whether or not we counted, whether or not Australians cared about either our plight or our rights as Australian citizens and as human beings. The campaign for the yes vote was framed as a race relations test for Australia, with voters reminded that the eyes of the world were upon us. But I'm not convinced that the yes vote did much for race relations in this country. And it's here I want to move to the amendment of section 51, which enabled the removal of the clause other than the Aboriginal people in any state. What has been referred to as the race power. Now, on this surface, this clause appeared to be racially discriminatory to Aboriginal people via the words other than the Aboriginal race. And for some, it suggested that the Commonwealth had no power to make laws for Aboriginal people. The removal of this clause was seen as a necessary first step toward enabling the Commonwealth to positively intervene on the oppressive conditions that Indigenous peoples were experiencing at the hand of state governments across the country. We later find this to be untrue. We can't consider amendments to section 51 without giving consideration to its initial intended purpose. The Constitution was drafted at a series of constitutional conventions in the 1890s and took effect on the 1st of January 1901. At this time, Aboriginal people were presumed to be a dying race and subjected to a range of state protectionist policies put in place to smooth the dying pillow. This explains that while we were erased people as Aborigines, we were not included in the race power of the Constitution. They did not have to count us or include us because we were going soon. The race power was drafted to enable the Commonwealth, according to Sir Edmund Barton in 1898, to regulate the affairs of the people of coloured or inferior races who are in the Commonwealth, and in particular pass laws restricting the immigration of the so-called alien races, such as the Kanakas, Chinese, Indians and Malays. It was to ensure that non-white races wouldn't stay. And certainly one of the first acts of the new Parliament following Federation was to restrict non-white, non-British immigration with the passing of the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901 and the Pacific Island Labourers Act. We commonly refer to this time as the White Australia Policy. In rationalising this policy of restricting immigration, Prime Minister Barton stated in 1901, "I do not think either that the doctrine of the equality of man was really ever intended to include racial equality. There is no racial equality, there is that basic inequality. These races are, in comparison with white races, I think no one wants convincing this fact, unequal and inferior. The doctrine of the equality of man was never intended to apply to the equality of the Englishman and the Chinaman. There is a deep-set difference and we see no prospect and no promise of its ever being effaced. Nothing in this world can put these two races upon an equality. Nothing we can do by cultivation, by refinement, or by anything else will make some races equal to others. Race, we see here, is not another category of description. It is the manner by which inequality is constructed, rationalised and regulated. Given that the race power was constructed to legally sanction racially discriminatory practices of the Commonwealth against non-white, non-British people, why would we be seeking to be explicitly included in it as Aborigines? How is our insertion as a raced people in a racially discriminatory clause within the Constitution emancipatory? In the early 1900s, there had been calls for the Commonwealth to play a greater role in Aboriginal affairs, with the presumption that the Commonwealth intervention would advance the interests of Aboriginal people. Given the civilising deeds of the state of Queensland were particularly brutal, it is little wonder that here in Queensland we would be appealing to the Commonwealth to intervene. The push towards Commonwealth control over Indigenous affairs had been intensifying in the 1950s, and socialist and feminist campaigner Lady Jessie Strait is attributed with signalling constitutional change as a necessary step toward improving the plight of Aboriginal Australia and the repeal of racially discriminatory laws that Aboriginal people had been subjected to. At this time, it was believed that our inclusion in Section 51 would enable the Commonwealth to pass legislation in favour of Aboriginal people and that it would take a greater administrative role in Aboriginal affairs. Yet this was not the case. The Holt government, according to Atwood and Marcus, proceeded with the referendum on the basis that it would not result in a change in the administration of Aboriginal affairs, but rather to redress the impression that the exclusion of Aboriginal people from the clause was discriminatory. From the government's perspective, the changes would maintain the status quo while protecting Australia's image abroad. One could argue that the referendum proposed to do more for white Australia than it did for Indigenous Australia, and this could perhaps explain why it was so successful. Holt's support for the yes vote in relation to Aborigines was fairly lacklustre, with the campaign largely driven by Fakatsi through the support of churches, the Labor Party and trade unions. Prime Minister Holt's press release post the referendum decision claimed that the vote will not only help the Aborigine, it will contribute to Australia's international standing by demonstrating to the outside world our overwhelming desire to give full acceptance to the Aboriginal people. We can see here that the vote was perhaps more about Australia's standing rather than the status of the Aborigine. Many commentators, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, have lamented how little has changed for Indigenous people as each anniversary passes us by. Now, in recognising the limitations of the referendum vote, I don't want to discount the impact that the vote had on many Indigenous and non-Indigenous people at a symbolic level at that time. Rodney Hall, novelist and member of the Queensland Council for the Advancement of Aborigines, recalls the impact of the yes vote here in Brisbane. He states, "There were black people on the streets in a way that we had never seen them. It was so touching. People were up, had washed their children, combed their hair and got themselves up in their very best gear and walked out in the streets of Brisbane, down Queen Street Mall, where they never went." Faith Bandler recalls going mad with excitement, not just at the vote, but the size of the yes vote. Indeed, it's remembered as the most resounding result in the history of referendums. Auntie Jackie Huggins has recalled as a child the shrieks of joy, laughter and tears when the result was announced. The referendum and the resounding support was a win, and a win based on a commitment that claimed to support Indigenous people's interests. It offered hope for Indigenous peoples that we had a place, not just in our nation's constitution, but in our nation's consciousness, in our nation's heart. At a time when everyday Indigenous peoples were being excluded from swimming at the local pool, enjoying a beer down the local pub, enrolling in school or enrolling to vote. There was a celebration at the promise of being able to enjoy the same rights, of being seen as human, even though the amended clauses would not directly bring that about. The government put to purpose the power conferred on the Commonwealth Parliament by the 1967 referendum through the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders Queensland Discriminatory Laws Act of 1975. This federal intervention overrode the then Queensland legislation with respect to the management of property, permit systems on reserves and employment and working conditions. A companion to this legislation was the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975, which made racial discrimination in certain contexts unlawful in Australia. The Racial Discrimination Act and the race powers of the Constitution were put to test in the High Court of Australia when the Bjelke-Petersen government sought to block Whigman John Koowarta from purchasing the Archer River cattle station in Cape York. The then Premier of Queensland did not approve the sale, as he did not believe that Aboriginal people should be able to acquire large areas of land. Koowarta appealed to the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission under the Racial Discrimination Act, asserting that the Queensland government's decision to block the sale was discriminatory. Koowarta's complaint was upheld. However, the Queensland government appealed to the Supreme Court and brought a separate action against the federal government, asserting that the federal government did not have the power to pass the Racial Discrimination Act. The High Court noted that Section 51 granted the Commonwealth the ability to make laws for Aboriginal people, but it did not mean that only laws benefiting people of any race could be passed. In fact, they noted it was originally designed to discriminate against the people of any race. The court agreed that the Commonwealth could make laws to prohibit discrimination against the people of any race, but this Act had no basis in any race power. Its validity was in relation to the Constitution's external affairs power. This brings into question the significance of the 1967 referendum as a stepping stone to addressing racial discrimination experienced by Indigenous Australians, but it also reminds us about the pervasiveness of race and the limitations of constitutional change. While Koowarta was successful in challenging Bjelke-Petersen's attempts to block the sale, at the last minute the Bjelke-Petersen government declared the Archer River property a national park so that no one could ever own it. According to Noel Pearson, old man Koowarta died a broken man, the winner of a landmark precedent, but the victim of appalling discrimination. I cannot help but draw parallels with the present irony in celebrating the referendum win, while Indigenous Australians continue to die earlier and live poorer, remaining landless in the lands that have and always will be ours. While the Racial Discrimination Act was critical to enabling the Mabo case to proceed, it is important to note that the Commonwealth has suspended the Racial Discrimination Act in this country on 3 occasions since it's been passed. And each and every time it has been in relation to Indigenous Australia. The first time it was in 1996 to enable the Hindmarsh Bill, which prevented a declaration being made under the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act. Basically, it stopped Aboriginal people who claimed the area as sacred from seeking to prevent the Hindmarsh Bridge from being built. In this case, we saw again the limitations of the limitations of the 1967 referendum and the Race Power Amendment. Legal representatives of the Aboriginal people had argued that the race's power was meant to protect Aboriginal people. However, the High Court found that this clause did not grant the federal government the power to prevent laws that disadvantaged Aboriginal people. In 1998, the Racial Discrimination Act was again suspended by the Howard government, a year after the landmark Mabo case, to water down native title with the Native Title Amendment Act. And just over a decade ago, the Howard government suspended the Racial Discrimination Act again to enact the Northern Territory Emergency Response, which enabled the federal government to impose bans on the sale and consumption of alcohol, the possession and supply of pornographic material, excluding consideration of customary law and cultural practice in sentencing and bail conditions, application of income management, denial of review by Social Security Appeals Tribunal of income management decisions. Interestingly, it also enabled modifications to the permit system to allow greater access to Aboriginal land and compulsory acquisition of 5-year leases over Aboriginal land without the compensation equivalent to that which other landholders would be entitled. You will note that on all 3 occasions on which the Racial Discrimination Act has been suspended in this country, it has involved disputes over land, and it has been to our detriment. Goldberg's words ring true in that land expansion continues to be rationalised on racial terms. Even in a so-called modern and civilised world, we can see the pervasiveness of race and the permissibility of racism. Racism is not just echoed in the words of right-wing commentators or the jokes of professional football players. It is ingrained in our society, enshrined in our institutions and our legislation, and can be accommodated at every turn. Race is inescapable. I therefore remain unconvinced by the promise of the Recognise campaign. I'm not convinced that we'll be any freer from race with the tinkering of a document that was crafted on the basis of us being racialised subjects, whether that is as non-existent or as recognised. I'm not convinced that we can attend to the foundational lies on which this country was built by simply editing sections of it in a way that makes us feel better about ourselves as a nation. The matter before us is not the wording of the Constitution. The matter before us is land and Indigenous people's rights, not as Australian citizens, but as First Nations peoples. If the 1967 referendum was the first step 50 years on, I'm not assuaged by the prospect that the Recognise campaign is the next step. I think there is a healthy scepticism, particularly from within the Indigenous community, about the promises of the Recognise campaign, which needs to be considered and given greater attention to. Unfortunately, it appears these concerns are drowned out by the need to get the majority of everyday Australians on side. In the same way that I failed to understand why we are seeking inclusion in the race power back in 1967, today I do not understand why we'd be seeking inclusion in what we know to be an inherently racist document. I'm sceptical about the notion that our rights as First Nations peoples will be remedied by our inclusion in a document that was premised upon the notion that we never existed and or that we were soon to vanish. To me, there is something deeply problematic about the fact that as 3% of the population, the recognition of our rights and the basis of that recognition as First Nations peoples is dependent upon the goodwill of non-Indigenous peoples to see us and recognise us, which is kind of ironic given one of Australia's favourite pastimes when it comes to the Aborigine is to insist that we aren't really Aboriginal, perpetuating the colonial myth that we aren't really here. And if we consider for a moment the racialised arithmetics of the situation, if the recognition of our rights is dependent upon the popular vote, what is proposed needs to attend to the needs and concerns of non-Indigenous Australians, not ours. What is often then becomes something that is acceptable to non-Indigenous Australia. And I again have to ask, then who is constitutional recognition for after all? We cannot talk about the future of constitutional change and the recognition of our rights without dealing with the racial realities of our social world. A few years ago, Beyond Blue commissioned a research evaluation of their Invisible Discriminator campaign. They found among a survey of everyday Australians that 1 in 5 admit to moving away if an Indigenous Australian sat near them. 1 in 5 would surveil Indigenous Australians in a shopping centre. 1 in 10 would not hire an Indigenous Australian. 1 in 3 believes us to be lazy, and almost half believe that Indigenous Australians are already given an unfair advantage by the government. Yet these are the people who have control over us. They have the power to determine not just on whether we get a job, but the very basis of our being here in this place and the nature of that recognition. I know that as a racialised subject, I've been subjected to various lies. Lies dressed up as racialised truths that insist upon my inferiority, and not just within health research. These lies surround us every day, and every day we are forced to combat them, resist them. But ultimately we have no choice but to live with them. In order to get by and get on in a social world that insists upon our inferiority, we often create for ourselves other lies. I remember the words of my father growing up, insisting that if I worked 10 times harder than them, that I'd make it. that it was possible to rise above my station and to rise above race. These were lies. Lies that we had to live with, lies that made the unjustness of the world seem less insurmountable. But I cannot be blinded to the ways in which my presence is read racially. Regardless of how hardworking I am, how articulate I may be, or how acceptable my presence might appear, nor can I be silent about it. It does not inhibit the surveillance by police who perceive my presence as a predisposition to an unknown criminal act. It does not inhibit a rendering of me as an Aboriginal mother or my husband as an Aboriginal father of 5 children in Inala being deemed at risk of not being able to look after my children properly. It does not prevent colleagues from seeing my presence as a scholar, as an equity act, as an accommodation of my intellectual incapability, or as a cultural broker to white knowing. The lie I can no longer live with is the insistence that our racialised being can be remedied through our own efforts, that if we just acted better, if we just articulated ourselves better, that if we were just recognised better, that our lives will be better. We need to face up to the lies about race which are bound up in the lies in the referendum campaign, both in its first and its next step. We need to face up to the lies that are told about us and the lies that we tell too. In this moment of honesty, I want to conclude with a confession. I honestly don't know how, if at all, we can overcome race completely. What I do believe, however, is that in facing up to these lies, it enables us to face up to the uncomfortable truths about who we really are as a nation. Race was the foundation on which this nation called Australia was built, and it continues to structure our society, its institutions, and our social life. We cannot build a better nation by simply piling new bricks or new clauses on top of it, cementing over the reality of race and the way it manifests interpersonally and institutionally. The silence and omission of Indigenous peoples from the Australian Constitution mirrors the silencing of conversations about racism in public, political and scholarly discourse. And at every turn, conversations about race are downplayed, dismissed, or booed into submission. It seems more effort in this country is spent on not looking racist than it is on not being racist. The danger of the next proposed referendum, is that recognition in whatever form it takes operates as simply a kind of rendering device, masking race rather than undermining it. If we have learnt anything from 50 years on, is that we cannot continue to talk about referendums, rights and recognition without talking honestly about how race works. So in reflecting upon the referendum today, I want to sincerely acknowledge the efforts of those who remain committed to eliminating racial discrimination. And I want to honour the intent of those who believe that the referendum would bring an end to racial discrimination. It was a remarkable feat that 50 years ago today, 90% of Australians supported in principle the idea of a fair go for Aborigines in amending the race power. But I also want to stress the importance that we not get too swept away with the idea that attending to the power of race is unfinished and/or that is confined to a constitutional clause or two. I just want to note that yesterday at a sunset ceremony at Uluru, hundreds of representatives from across the country issued the Uluru Statement. From this, it is clear that the next real step for this nation is not another referendum, but a treaty. The question remains, will we be heard? Thank you.
So thank you, Chelsea Bond. And I think Chelsea has delivered to us a very compelling keynote this morning. And I'd like to acknowledge the courage, Chelsea, that you've shown in sharing your views with us. And you said at the beginning, you said you want to be provocative. And I think in the positive sense of provocative, you provoked us to think and reflect on what you've said. And I think that we can carry those conversations through over the next week and into the future as well. the State Library, the principles of a library is freedom of information and freedom of expression. And part of those principles is that we value diverse voices and diverse opinions. And I think that's a key part of the discussions that we will have now and into the future. So thank you once again, Chelsea. Thank you. Our 50 years and counting Community Day continues until 4 p.m, and shortly there'll be guided tours of our latest exhibitions, Don't Just Count Us, Let Us Count, which is on level 1 in Curl-Dargan, and Freedom Then, Freedom Now, which further explores the 1967 referendum, as well as broader themes surrounding civil liberties in Queensland. Richard Bell's iconic tent embassy is set up on Maywar Green, which is between the State Library and Goma, and it's featuring a range of film screenings this morning and tent talks this afternoon with Dr Mary Graham, Bo Spearham and MC Trix. So as you leave the auditorium this morning, I encourage you to reflect on the historic and contemporary significance of this occasion and engage in discussions around the topic today and in the future. I also invite you to explore the Right Wrongs digital exhibition, which brings together stories, historical collections and information from all state libraries across Australia to examine how far we've come since 1967. So Right Wrongs is the name of the website, and as I said, it's been developed by the State Libraries of Australia and the National Library, together with IATSIS and the ABC. And you can view it in Curl-Dargan on level 1, but as well as that online in your own time at abc.net.au/rightwrongs, and we'll put the link up on our website as well. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and take the opportunity to participate in the activities that I've just outlined. So thank you for attending. Thank you.